Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, Part 2. The story opens with the following words. By late accounts from Rotterdam, that city seems to be in a high state of philosophical excitement. Indeed, phenomena have there occurred of a nature so completely unexpected, so entirely novel, so utterly at variance with the preconceived opinions, as to leave no doubt on my mind that ere long this all Europe is in an uproar, all physics in ferment, all reason and astronomy together by the ears. The story is meant to be read as a satire, which intention is clear immediately by poking fun at some of the same devices of verisimilitude that made the scientists' report in the balloon hoax so convincing. First, in the tradition of the 19th century German novella, the events are said to be novel but true. And second, they're said to have taken place on the day of blank, for the narrator says he is not positive about the date. To use the convention of naming the exact date of an event only to leave the date blank is to expose the convention itself and to announce the story as parody. Poe originally intended to write another hoax with this novella, but the hyperbolic opening gave it away. The opening is clearly satirical. High state of philosophical excitement, all Europe is in an uproar, all physics in a ferment, and so on, are clear hyperbole and thus easily to read as satire. It appeared to be, yes, it was undoubtedly a species of balloon, but surely no such balloon had ever been seen in Rotterdam before. For who, let me ask, ever heard of a balloon manufactured entirely of dirty newspapers? As to the shape of the phenomenon, it was even still more reprehensible, being little or nothing better than a huge full cap turned upside down. When the balloon descends, instead of being described in minute and believable particulars, as it is in the balloon hoax, it is metaphorically made of what indeed the balloon in the balloon hoax was made of, literally. That is, newspapers. Instead of having the aerodynamic shape it has in the balloon hoax, it has the satiric shape of a huge fool's cap turned upside down. The rest of the story tells how he got to the moon. Pfaall is nothing if not exact, and his seemingly scientific in his descriptions, citing authorities, measuring velocities and bulks, observing the Earth, the moon, the meteorites from different apogees each day. Although the bulk of the story, which purports to be from a manuscript dropped from the balloon by a strange little man, presents Hans Pfaall's journey to the moon in a strictly verisimilar way or style. At the end, Poe suggests the fictionality of the story by pointing out that many people have called it a hoax. The letter, having been published, gave rise to a variety of gossip and opinion. Some of the overwise even made themselves ridiculous by decrying the whole business as nothing better than a hoax. Then, as if to undercut what he has exposed, he claims that for such people, the word hoax is a general term for all matters above their comprehension. In other words, for Poe, hoax is simply a word for a fiction presented as if it were a reality. The ending of the story, of course, is highly satirical, designed to make the supposedly wise people look even sillier, and to introduce in the end to the reader that perhaps the story is not fictional after all. In addition to the satirical name Hans Pfaall, which we have already analyzed, we meet the mayor of Rotterdam, the Burgermaster Mynheer Superbus van Onterdonk, and Professor Rub-a-Dub, again clear invocations of the manner in which Rabelais and Swift named characters. The Frau Gretel Pfaall, upon sight of it, uttered an exclamation of joyful surprise and declared it to be the identical hat of her good man himself. Now this was a circumstance the more to be observed, as Pfaall, with 3 companions, had actually disappeared from Rotterdam about 5 years before in a very sudden and unaccountable manner. This quotation not only establishes the characters of the story, but also lets us know that once again the story will be told as a flashback. Here we have the hero of the story, Hans Pfaall, returning from his journey to the moon, having left Rotterdam 5 years before. The description of the construction of the balloon once again reads like a technical document rather than a novel or short story. What is Poe doing here? I drew up to my eyes each of my hands, one after the other, and wondered what occurrence could have given rise to the swelling of the veins and the horrible blackness of the fingernails. I afterward carefully examined my head, shaking it repeatedly and feeling it with minute attention until I succeeded in satisfying myself that it was not, as I had more than half suspected, larger than my balloon. Then, in a knowing manner, I felt in both my breeches pockets, and missing therefrom a set of tablets and a toothpick case, endeavored to account for their disappearance, and not being able to do so, felt inexpressibly chagrined. It now occurred to me that I suffered great uneasiness in the joint of my left ankle, and a dim consciousness of my situation began to glimmer through my mind. What is happening here? If we read carefully and understand the context following, we realize that when Pfaall regains consciousness, he discovers that he's hanging upside down from the bottom of the basket by a rope wrapped around his left ankle while the balloon is rising high above the ocean. But he says, I was neither astonished or horror-stricken. Part of me wants to laugh at the comic, clownish image that I imagine in this scene, which also recalls the, quote, highly irregular departure of the Wizard from Oz near the end of the movie. But part of me shivers that the thought of waking up and finding oneself hanging upside down with nothing below to catch the body should the rope break or the legs slip out of the knot. The story continues for quite a bit with a lot of faulty science and fractured physics. Why? Part of the reason, I think, is Poe again is plagiarizing works of astronomy to fill pages, but also to add some verisimilitude to the story. Of course, much of the science in the story was quite unknown at the time. For example, if the balloon were at 3 3/4 miles, or about 20,000 feet, the lack of air pressure would already start with the trouble breathing, and the temperature would already be below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. As on page 964, looking at a gunship on the ocean would probably look even smaller than the size of a domino. Another fault is the faulty medicine. I finally succeeded in opening a vein in my right arm with the blade of my penknife. The blood had hardly commenced flowing when I experienced a sensible relief, and by the time I had lost about a half a moderate basinful, most of the worst symptoms had abandoned me entirely. For centuries, bloodletting was believed to cure a number of ailments, including hypertension, and it was only in the 20th century that medicine became advanced enough to know that bloodletting probably killed more people than it helped. Drawing blood may have given Pfaall some temporary relief, but the issue he describes here really has nothing to do with blood pressure and more to do with air pressure. But unlike in the science fiction movies, the body won't expand and explode. Reading this section of the story actually made me curious enough to find out what does happen to the human body in a vacuum. Take a look at the link I posted under supplemental resources. But I was not prepared to find them upon close examination, evidently enjoying a high degree of health, breathing with the greatest ease and perfect regularity, and evincing not the slightest sign of any uneasiness whatsoever. I could only account for this by extending my theory and supposing that the highly rarefied atmosphere around might perhaps not be, as I had taken for granted, chemically insufficient for the purposes of life, and that as a person born in such a medium might possibly be unaware of any inconvenience attending its inhalation. Given what we now know about the atmosphere, it is of course an absurd theory that an animal born in a rarefied atmosphere would have no trouble breathing in that atmosphere. But, you might ask, where did Poe get this crazy notion? But then think about cultures that live at high elevations, such as the Incas in Cusco in Peru at 11,151 feet, or Lhasa in Tibet at 12,002 feet, or El Alto in Bolivia at 13,615 feet. Someone who's used to living at that sea level can't just go to one of these places of high altitude and breathe normally. It takes time to adjust. Even when I went last year to Puebla in Mexico, which is 7,091 feet above sea level, it took me almost a week to get to the point of being able to breathe normally. So it is understandable if someone born there is used to normal breathing that Poe could extrapolate that anyone born at any altitude would not have trouble breathing in his natural habitat. Aside from the obvious fallacy, we also have to note that even some people not born at those altitudes still relatively quickly adjust to the atmospheric conditions. On page 985, Pfaall's interest in the poles reflects the 19th century obsession with discovery of the poles, as we saw in some of the narrative that Poe, quote, borrowed in Arthur Gordon Pym. But to give you some perspective, Poe says that the balloon had reached an altitude of 7,254 miles above the surface of the seas. The space station, in contrast, rotates between 230 and 620 miles. At 7,000 miles, Pfaall could no longer be experiencing night and day. He is well beyond the Earth's atmosphere, which ends at about 300 miles above sea level. On pages 996 to 1001 is a note appended to the tale from the 1840 edition of the story. Poe makes additional comments about the nature of hoaxes by referring to the famous Moon Story hoax of the New York Sun editor Richard Adams Locke, which appeared soon after this story was published. Although Poe admits that his own story has the tone of banter, whereas the Locke hoax is presented in earnest, he notes that both attempt to, quote, give plausibility in scientific detail. He then proceeds to expose the fictionality of Locke's hoax and to review other Voyage to the Moon stories, most of which are satirical in aim, but none of which makes any effort at plausibility. He claims that his own design in Hans Pfaall is original inasmuch as it combines a whimsical tone and satiric intention with scientific principles and verisimilitude. The importance of this combination for Poe is that whereas in satire the tone makes it obvious that the work is fictional, in verisimilitude, which is synonymous with hoax, the technique is to convince the reader of the reality of the event. This raises the question in ongoing literary critical debates about whether Hans Pfaall should be considered a hoax. Poe insists that he was writing fictional satire, but do we trust him? Did he want to create another hoax with the same critical reception that the balloon hoax inadvertently created? The story was first published in the Southern Literary Messenger in June 1835 as Hans Pfaall, a Tale. Consider the differences between the original title and the revision. What might readers expect from the story from the different titles? To consider whether the story should be read as a tale or as a hoax, consider the original editorial introduction. Quote, Mr. Poe's story will add much to his reputation as an imaginative writer, and the editorial praised the, quote, impossibilities of the story that the writer, quote, details with a minuteness so much like truth that they seem quite probable. Consider the following in the reprint from 1840. Why did Poe add this note at the end of Hans Pfaall? What does it argue? What is the tone of the note? How does and or doesn't it sound like the story? In what ways is it relevant to the story? More specifically, how does Poe's classification of the story as a hoax relate to the discussion of hoaxing in the story itself? How does the note affect our conclusions about the story? How might you have read the story differently if you had read the note first? By the end of the story, we begin to understand how early science fiction, by presenting itself as scientific information rather than literary invention, borrowed on the growing popular credibility of science to gain the attention and endorsement of a culture that was increasingly encouraged to value science at the expense of literature. Perpetrated in print, scientific hoaxes succeeded in deceiving the public by exploiting the indeterminacy of authority that was an inevitable effect of the chaotic print culture of the mid-19th century. Given its conclusion, what is Hans Pfaall finally a story about? Does Hans Pfaall have a moral? We will continue the discussion in this week's discussion forum.